Hello also from my side, and it's nice that you're having me here again at the Stammtisch. Some of you might remember the last time I gave a talk here at the Stammtisch. It's nearly 2 years ago now, and the last time I talked about tricks and tips when using the ELN Chemotion, and this was more or less a way of workarounds if there are some features or functions that don't work for you in the ELN at that moment. And today we're going a bit deeper into the program and talking about generic elements, which might be the solution for workarounds being necessary at all. And I split this talk in 3 parts. A short part in the beginning about the default element types in Chemotion. Afterwards, the largest part will be on generic elements. I'd like to introduce them shortly and afterwards show you some hands-on examples in the ELN and how to set them up. And I'll end with some concluding remarks on possibilities, maybe restrictions or further perspectives here. So I won't go too much into detail here on this basic function of Chemotion and how to use these basic functions, because there were some talks in the Stammtisch on these topics already, and you will find them in the documentation of Chemotion and so on. But just to show you the, let's say, state of the art of elements that you can use in Chemotion, I have gathered them here. And for those of you who are familiar with the ELN, this is the general overview in the ELN. And when you're in one of your collections, you'll see this overview here with the element bar. And when we zoom in here a little bit more, you see these 5 pictograms. And these are the 5 element types that are available. These are samples, reactions, well plates, screens, and research plans, and we will go into detail of them now, starting with samples, which is more or less the center of the ELN. So you have an overview on your molecules. You can draw molecules here. You can add properties of the molecules. Some properties are already generated automatically, and you can also add analytic data. The next thing are the reactions, which are the classic documentation type in the ELN, where you can drag and drop molecules you already created before, so your samples, into reactions. You can also add here all necessary information for reactions, so you can put their analytic data, you can add descriptions, TLC controls, and so on and so forth. And this works, I think I have some more pictures here, for many analysis types. And you can use this function for documenting mostly organic reactions. The well plate function goes more into the direction of bioactivity studies for biochemists. So you have this designer over here where you can also drag and drop molecules from your database into this well plate, and you can add further descriptions. You can upload readouts from your well plates you did in the lab and sum it all up here. And if you're doing multiple well plates, you can use the screens function as some kind of assay of multiple well plates. You can drag and drop them also into this screen as some overall experiment over all your well plates that are connected to each other. And the last default entry type is the research plan, which is a bit more generic. So you can add text fields, tables, pictures, you can add reactions and so on. You can drag and drop them. As you can see here, you can move them around and then individualize this research plan to your needs, which is more or less the first step into generic elements, because these 5 are the default settings, which work fine if you're an organic chemist or a biochemist, for example. But otherwise, if you need some more individual features, or you have the needs for specific fields in a reaction that aren't there by default, you might be lost with these functions. And that's why we're now talking about generic elements. And I just have one simple slide on this one here in the presentation, which gives you first the link to the documentation. There are some basic information. You can type this link in, you can copy it, or you can just scan the QR code over here. And this picture you see is taken from this documentation. And it shows you the overall build-up of the ELN with the highest hierarchy level of documentation. This is the element type. So what you see in the ELN, these tabs are elements, and you can then add to your element further segments, which will be visible as additional tabs over here. And in each of these elements or segments, you have a substructure with layers, and in each layer there are multiple fields. So this is the basic build-up of elements in the ELN, and this also applies to generic elements. And to show you this one a bit more in detail, we now switch to the ELN, and I'm there already logged in at the administration user interface. So right now it's only possible to add generic elements, segments, and datasets here in the admin UI, and not as a user. So you have to have access as an admin to the ELN instance. And before even going to these sections over here, I'd like to show you shortly that you can enable generic elements, or you have to enable generic elements for the users. You can set their specific users so that only these people can see them. You can enable it globally so that everybody can see the things, or you can even exclude users. So with this function, you can very specifically set which user is able to see generic elements, segments, or datasets. Now, when we're looking at the generic elements tab over here, you see there is a bunch of things already because we created some things here in this test instance. But I like to start from the beginning by creating a new element, and that you can do by simply click on this new element button, and a new pop-up window opens up where you can set a name to the element, which has to be some abbreviation so that Chemotion recognizes this specific element type. So let's call it just somehow. You can then give this one a prefix, so which is added to your entries in the ELN. For reactions, for example, it's this letter R that is additionally added, and you can set things here. Just let's go just for the same thing again, and then the element label is the exact name of the element which is displayed. So maybe when you're doing, for example, catalysis or things, you can name this one like this. You can add a hover information. So when you're over the label, this additional information are given. Let's say something like a tool to add catalytic to your ELN. And what you can additionally do is set an icon for your element type. You can choose from the font awesome code. I opened this up already, and I just decided for the thermometer to be our icon here. And then you can just create this one, and you will see that the new element is created with all your information. You can add these information you said before, but you can't change the element abbreviation, which is now part of your ELN and with which your element is recognized. Everything else you can change. You can update these information, then you can delete elements, or you can activate them for the users to be seen. And now you can start editing this entry. So I just clicked over here at Edit Element Template. And you see right now in this template overview, there's nothing, as we haven't started anything yet. But you see an overview over the layers. As I said, in every element or segment, there's a substructure with the layers, and you can then start by adding a layer. Just name it somehow to keep it simple. I just start by A. You can then say the ELN how much columns should appear in this element in this layer next to each other. So we just stick to 3. You can give it a sequential position so that all your layers are sorted in your element. You can change the color of the header as you like, and then add it to your template. And you see now you have a new layer. It's completely empty. We directly create another one below, just to show you this one. Let's go for another color. And you see now you have these 2 new layers. You can edit the layer as you can edit elements, and then you can add fields to your layer. Sorry. Right, you can add fields over here by just putting giving them a name. So here, maybe we like to add the mass or the volume of things we like to add to our layer. We can add samples and so on. You can just name those fields, and when you're clicking in one of the fields, you see the information of this field. The name you can still add, change. You can also add here an hover information, and then there is the type of field, and there's a whole bunch of things you can add. We won't go through everything right here. I just show you the documentation shortly, because when you're scrolling down over here, down here, you see there's a table with possible fields and what you can do with these fields. So you have an overview over here on what is possible with the generic elements feature. So as we want to add the mass here, I call this one system defined, and now I can add some unit, for example, the mass. We do the same with the volume. Just to give you 2 examples. And another possible field type is drag sample, which we will do over here. So now we have 3 new fields, and if you want to have a look at how this would look like, you can just say save and release or save as a draft. When you save it as a draft, you saved your changes, and if you additionally release this one, if it's already active and people are able to, users are able to see this one, the changes are also released in the ELN interface. So we can just have a look over here when clicking on preview, and you'll see now how this element type would look like. So we have the mass, we have these 3 columns next to each other as planned. We have the mass, we can change between the units. The same with the volume and the sample. When you're in the ELN, now you have the possibility to drag samples from your collections over here. And another thing you can do is add dummy fields. So leave things empty by just clicking on this button. And another thing I like to show you now is just as one of the possibilities is the list function. So you can say, okay, I want a select list over here. So I can select between different options. And select list you have to create before in this section over here for select list. Click on add a select list. And we do just one for a test, and you can input options. So for example, B, C, E, this way. And now this select list, which is called test, you can choose over here. We save and release this one again. And you'll see in the preview, now here is some blank space as we added a dummy field. And next to this one is a list with the options you set before, B, C, and D. Why I showed you this one is simply that you can also add restrictions, and you can add restrictions for layers or specific fields. And we like to do this now for the layer B. So we open the restriction settings, add one, and say, okay, when in the layer A, in the field list we added here, the value is B, then only then our new layer appears. Maybe a little bit easier when I show you this one. Now you see we still have our layer A over here and no next layer. When you choose now in the list C or D, nothing happens, but when you're choosing B, the new layer opens up. And so you can very individually set things here in the generic elements. This was just a short test to show you which things are possible over here. As I mentioned in the documentation, there is a list on fields you can add to your generic elements right now. This list is extended. So there are new functions coming up. But for example, you can drag things, you can add just a simple checkbox. You can add also tables or text formulas, things a bit too much into detail for right now. And that's why we stick to this one, but you can still have a closer look. The thing I'd just like to mention here, you can not only edit this in the template as you see it in the admin interface, but you can also edit the element template in JSON format. So when you're clicking here, you can add information into the JSON file format. And so you're also able to upload things other people already did. Or if you're more into coding JSON format, you can do this over here. And then also save this one. Okay. The other two things I just mentioned briefly, the segments and the data sets. The segments are like an element. So we have this tab, as I mentioned, but it's added to an existing element. So when you're creating a new segment, you have to assign this to a specific element. So all the elements you set before, you can choose over here, and then you have the same options like for elements, just as another tab afterwards. I will show you in an example right now. And everything has to be assigned to a specific element. But if you have something already available, for example, for a sample, you can just copy this segment, design a new segment and add it to something like a reaction and use this one as well. The data sets belong to analytic methods. So for example, the H1 NMR spectroscopy, you see over here, there is already a template generated for this one. And this one will be added to data sets you upload. And when you're then choosing 1H NMR, this information is additionally given in the data set. And in the long term, this should enable automatic metadata harvesting within your ELN, so that you upload, for example, a simple NMR file, and then Chemotion directly knows, for example, which solvent you used and other things on the instrument, for example, which are available in these raw data files. So now let's move on to the ELN. And you see here the general overview as we saw it before. But now we want to change this, the way our element bar is structured. We can do so by clicking on this sliders button. And you see there are the elements that are preset. And if you don't use some of these, you can move them over here into this gray area, so they won't show up anymore in your overview, or you can move things around if you like to see by default reactions as the first thing in your collection. You can move this here, and you can also add generic elements. And I just show you two we did before. This for catalytic reactions. You can then just click this plus button and see the catalysis characterization. Just as an example, here we have some table to add components. You can just add entries with all the information you need. You can have here some checkboxes. You can add files and things like this. Just to give you a glimpse how one of these generic elements could look like in the end. And then you have the information over here. The other thing I opened up were devices. So when you're adding a device, you can maybe say, okay, we have 3 devices for measuring UV vis, and you can add these 3 devices over here. They might differ in the specifications a little bit, but then when you have them in your ELN, you can add devices also to other, let's say, experiments. So you don't have to type in information here again, but you can just use the things that are already given. When you're now looking not for element generic elements, but for segments, you can do the same. So we have some segments for the sample tab over here, so we can change this with the sliders bar over here and add this catalytic characterization also as a segment in the sample tab. So if you want to just add more information over here, you can do so by just clicking. And the last thing, the data sets. When you add a new data set to a sample, for example, choose 1H NMR spectroscopy. As I mentioned, you see now when you want to upload a new data set, you have all these additional information over here in the dataset window. This is how it works right now. Where it goes to, I just show you briefly, because all this editing was on the admin interface. And in further versions of the ELN, it will change to the user interface. So we have here now the test instance from the KIT and are logged in as a user, as you can see. And then instead of going to the admin interface and only a few people have rights to change things, you have the generic designer over here. And this one has the same features as I showed you before on the admin interface. And you can just have a look at the templates. You can change them if you have, as a user, the right to change them. So it makes it easier in the long run. I shortly change now again to the presentation for some concluding remarks on the possibilities and limitations of the generic elements. Starting with the possibilities, you might have seen the most of them right now. There is much more about the ELN than just the default settings, so you can customize everything as you need. And when doing so for a whole installation of the ELN, you have a certain standardization. So not everybody is typing in things in the research plan as I like to do, but if you have a generic element that is the same for everybody, you standardize the way things are documented in your ELN. Additionally, you have the availability, so everybody who's working on the same instance of the ELN has access to all the generic elements if they are enabled as a user. You can benefit from others, so if another university, institute, or working group already designed a generic element or segment that fits your needs, or nearly fits your need, you can just copy their JSON file and edit then the already existing generic elements to your specific needs. And with this, in the end, you can represent everything you like to represent in an ELN. Going over to the limitations, most of them applying only right now. Some of them might be solved in the future, as I already told you. Right now, you can only edit these generic elements on the admin user interface and not as a user, which will change in the near future. There are right now limited features. So I told you about checkboxes, tables. You can calculate things, you can add masses and so on. But there is still progress going on with the features available for generic elements. And then this will be enhanced in the future as well. The entry sharing, so if you have your generic elements in your ELN and want to share your results with somebody, you can easily do so with people working on the same ELN instance, because they also have access to your generic elements, but you can't simply share these entries outwards. And additionally, right now, there's no preset report function for these element types. So when you're using the ELN, you might know that you can simply give out a report of reactions and samples and so on by just clicking in a button, and afterwards you might end up with perfectly fine supporting information for a paper, but this doesn't work for generic elements right now. And a thing that I guess won't change is that you can't publish these generic elements in the Chemotion repository, at least as they are, because there is the Chemotion repository, which is connected to the ELN, is predominantly meant for reactions and samples. And if you have other needs and design these generic elements, you can document your things, but you can't upload them to the repository, at least in this form. But as you already have all your things together, then in your ELN, you can simply transfer these things to maybe another repository that even fits your needs better. So this was a very rough overview on the generic elements in Chemotion, and thank you all for your kind attention.